Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to another layout update on the Modular Model Railway. Now, in the previous episode, you saw me installing the point motors on the two station modules, and at the end of that episode, I said that it was now time to start work on the scenery. So, that's what I'm going to be doing today, and as you probably guessed from the title of this video, I'm going to be building the station platforms, which is quite exciting. Now, there are loads of different ways to build platforms and various different techniques that people use to achieve some amazing results. I've actually come up with my own technique, which I came up with all the way back in January earlier this year when I was first building the station modules and laying the track on them. And that was to use foam board, strips of foam board that I was going to layer up on top of each other. That would form the basic structure of the platform, and then I would paint it and make it all look fantastic. I thought that was an original idea, but in the last few months I've seen several other railway modelers use this exact same technique. So I don't know whether we've all just had the same idea at the same time and it's great minds think alike, or if it was just a technique that's been out there for ages and I'm not actually as clever as I thought I was. It's probably the latter. Anyway, that's going to be the technique I'm using, so let's get to it, shall we? This is the main station module, and like most of the layout at the moment, it's looking a bit bare. However, once we get the platforms on, things will hopefully start coming together. Of course, the first thing I have to do, which I've done on all of my modules so far, is to paint the sides of the rails. I've shown this process plenty of times on the channel now, so we'll watch a speeded up version here, but if you do want to see it in more detail, I have covered it in other videos like my ballasting tutorial. The reason I'm doing this now is because once the platforms are in place, I think it'll just be more awkward to get in and actually paint the track, especially on the outer edges. I did also have to do a point this time, which was a little bit different. You can see that I'm not painting the area where the switch blades touch the main rail, and this is so that the power still transfers from one to the other. I can paint the other side of the rail though, I just have to be careful that it doesn't spill over to the other side. Another option would also be to make the whole point live, either by using electrofrogs or by soldering dropper wires directly to the blades. However, the way I've got my layout set up for DCC means that it's literally only the blades themselves that are relying on this contact. It also means I still have the option of running the layout under DC power as well for some of my older locos, and in that instance, switching the points will control the flow of power. And of course, I've painted the rust effect onto the chairs very carefully as well. As I've said in the past, this is a time-consuming process, but I do think it makes all the difference. For the actual platform structure itself, I'm going to use strips of foam board. This foam board is 5mm thick, and with 4 layers stacked on top of each other, that gives me a platform height of 20mm. Normally this would be a bit high, but don't forget I've also got the track on 3mm cork as well, so that brings the height of the platforms down to 17mm, which is a bit more realistic. You can see I planned for this when I designed the end plates for this module, as the cutouts for the platforms match the height of the foam board. So the first thing to do is to join all 4 of these strips together to make a nice solid platform. I'm just using PVA for this, and once I've got it on the foam board, I spread it around to make sure all the corners and edges are covered. I then took another layer of foam board and pressed this down into the glue, making sure it was lined up with the first layer. And then I just repeated this a couple more times to make up a platform. You may have also noticed that the sides aren't very neat on these strips, but don't worry because these are going to be covered as you'll see now. So, if you remember the episode where I installed the tunnel mouth, I made a little bit of an interior for the tunnel itself. For that I used some moulded stone sheets from the Slater's Plasticard range, and I enjoyed using this so much that I decided to use it again for the side of the platforms. Here I'm just cutting strips of the plasticard that are 20mm high, and conveniently this lined up perfectly with one of the mortar courses, which will make things a lot easier when I'm joining them up later. Nevertheless, it was still vital to use the cutting mat and a steel ruler to make sure I got a nice straight line. Now this particular sheet is actually intended for 7mm scale models, so more like O gauge, but that said, I really like the size of these stone blocks and they match up well with what I've used on other parts of the layout. And then with all the strips cut, I put down a base of tan coloured paint. I know this is quite similar to the original colour of the plasticard, but I have found that it helps it give it a bit more of a matte finish. In fact, I actually omitted this step when I was doing it for the tunnel interior, and while the result wasn't terrible, I did feel it could be a bit better, which is why I did it differently this time. Once the tan colour was dry, I then splashed some grey paint over the tan and then dabbed this off with a tissue. This stops everything from becoming one solid colour and gives the stone a nice random variation along the length of the platform. I also decided not to use any white paint to highlight the mortar courses. My reasoning for this is that the station would be quite dirty with trains constantly coming in and out, and so the dirt and grime would have built up over the years on the sides as well as on the tracks. So with the plasticard strips complete, we'll let the paint dry and then head back to the foam board structures that I glued together earlier. Thankfully my main structure is now dry, so I can cut this down to the length I want the platform to be. I also needed to cut a ramp into the ends of the platform too, so I marked my start and end point, and then drew a diagonal line from one to the other. And then using a little handsaw, I cut this ramp into the foam board. Just like the sides, I don't need this to be neat or tidy, as I'll be covering all this up later on anyway. And speaking of the sides, my plasticard strips are now dry, so I can glue these on to make it look like the platform is made from stone. I'm using my old friend super glue for this, as I wanted them to dry fairly quickly so I could line up the next one along. And actually, when it comes to lining them up, I'm generally trying to make sure that they're flat along the top. Any issues at the bottom will most likely be hidden by the ballast when I eventually get round to adding that. And for the end of the platform, I now need to cut the strips to follow the slope of the ramp. This time, using the foam board structure as a guide, I marked the ramp on the plasticard strip. You'll notice it's not exactly the same. I actually want the plasticard strip to be slightly higher than the foam board. This comes back again to how I'll be covering up that rough surface of the foam board ramp later on. Now with that cut, I can then glue the final strip in place. You'll also notice at the other end where the platform meets the baseboard join, I've left a little bit of an overhang here. This just takes into account the depth of the end plate, so that when the platform is pushed into position, it also covers those 3mm of hardboard and makes the joint a bit more seamless. So that's one platform complete and ready to glue in place. But as this station is going to have two platforms, I now need to repeat everything I've just done again for the other side. So let's go back to the beginning and do that now. I'm just kidding, I did all that off camera, and here you can see I've got the second platform ready to go. You can see this one is also curved at the end to account for how the track joins back to the main line. Despite that small curve though, I want to make sure that the rest of my track is straight before I fit the platforms in place. I'm doing this with a steel ruler up against the outside rail, and this allows me to check that there aren't any wobbles along the length of the module. Even just a few millimeters here and there could end up with carriages or locos scraping along the platforms in certain areas, so it's best to make sure that everything is straight right now. This brings me neatly onto my next point, which is actually checking the clearances for the locos and rolling stock. I'm mostly using a Mark I coach for this, as it's mainly what I'll be running on the line, but I do know that my Flying Scotsman model is quite wide, so I'm taking that into account too. The straight platform is actually fairly easy, as I can just adjust this backwards and forwards now that I know the track is straight. All I have to do is find the best compromise to minimise the gap between the carriage and the platform, whilst also making sure the wider locos still fit. The curved platform is a bit more tricky though, as I need to account for how carriages and locos swing out on the curves. Once I was happy with the positioning though, I added some glue to the bottom of the platforms and stuck them down to the baseboard, and I did this following marks that I made when I was checking the clearances. And then of course, while the glue is still wet, I did just check one last time to make sure that everything was okay. And then I left them both to dry. The glue is now dry, and I want to add a bit more of a realistic surface to the foam board. For this, I'm going to add a very thin layer of filler along the platform, and I'm hoping that this will end up looking much more like tarmac than the shiny smooth surface of the foam board. There isn't really any trick to this, it's a fairly simple process, which is just adding the filler, spreading it all out, and then trying to get it as smooth and flat as possible. When it comes to doing the ramps, initially I was just using the filler to build up the level to the height of the plasticard edges. This smoothed out the rough cuts that I'd made to the foam board earlier, and then when I had the slope about right, I sorted out the top surface. As the filler was much thicker here, I opted to do this in several stages, so I added some filler and let it dry, and then added another layer and then let that dry, and then put on the final layer. With all the filler down, I then had to wait for it all to completely dry before I moved on. And then I got bored of waiting. Next, I used some sandpaper to sand down the surface. Surprisingly, I'd actually done a fairly good job of getting a flat and even surface, but this did just help to smooth out any odd bumps. Now, I did get a few small cracks and holes in the surface, but actually I'm quite pleased about this, as it makes it more realistic in my eyes. Seriously, take a look at any platform or car park and you'll see that the surface has cracks and little holes and gaps all over it. If I'd have tried to do this deliberately, it would have looked a bit contrived, but the filler itself has cracked in a natural way, and so I'm quite pleased with the effect. And then at this point, I decided to give the platforms a coat of paint. Conveniently, I had a half-used tin of grey emulsion lying around, which was about the right colour, and there was enough left over to use on the platforms. As this goes on, you can see it really does transform the platforms, and this area is starting to look a bit more like a station now.
So at this point I have to admit that I made a bit of a mistake. Or not that I made a mistake, but that I kind of changed my mind about something halfway through the process. So after I'd painted the surface grey, what I was going to do to follow up was paint a very fine white line along the very edge. And after that I was going to call it done, that was it, and that was going to be the end of the video. Except the more that I was looking at the platforms, especially now I could see them in reality and not just how I was imagining them in my head, there was something I was noticing that wasn't quite right about them. And so I started looking at real platforms, especially those on heritage railways, and I noticed that a lot of them have these big sort of paving slabs along the very edge. And not only that, but these slabs sort of hang over as well. So it's not just a straight drop down to the rails, there's a little bit of an overhang there as well. And so really, the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to try and include this on my own platforms. So I had a bit of a think, and this is what I came up with.
So here I have some more sheets of Slater's plasticard, and these ones are moulded in the style of paving slabs. My plan with these is to cut off individual strips, paint them up, and then stick them down to the edge of the platform. So the first step is cutting them off, and I found that using the steel ruler again really helped for this. I lined it up so that my knife naturally rests in the gap underneath the first line of paving slabs, and this means I'll get a nice straight edge. And as for cutting itself, I just make several light cuts,
gradually cutting through more of the plastic with each pass. As you can see, I had to cut several of these strips so that I had enough slabs to run the full length of both my platforms. With that done though, it's now on to painting. Now I want these to be similar in colour palette to the stonework I did earlier, and of course the grey platform surface, but I do want them to stand out slightly. I'm actually going to use the same colours here, but the opposite way around this time. So first I put on the grey paint, when that had dried I then used the tan colour as my top layer. Once this was on, I then dabbed it off using the same technique I did on the stonework earlier. This time though, because the top layer was the tan paint, it's given it a much lighter appearance, while the colours themselves are still the same. Hopefully this will make it look like it's the same type of stone that's been used, but it's been treated or prepared in a slightly different way, which gives it this subtle variation. Next, it was time to paint the all-important white line that you see down the edge of nearly every platform. To do this, I just used some masking tape to hold down each strip, while also leaving a tiny section uncovered at the top. And then I painted the uncovered part of the slab with white paint. I wasn't too fussed about making it consistent here, as remember in the real world paint markings like this do fade over time and they're never perfect. By the way, the reason I decided to paint this line now in sections rather than when all the strips are stuck to the platform was just because I felt it was easier to do it this way. I just had to make sure that the width of the white marking was roughly the same on each strip. If there's any small differences though, I can always fill it in later, but as long as it's pretty much the same, it should be alright. And when the white mark is fully painted on a strip, I can then remove the masking tape, and as you can see, we have a clear white line along the side with a nice straight edge. Now that my paving slabs are complete, it's time to add them to the platform surfaces. Again, I did this using super glue, which meant I was able to get all of these stuck down in position really quickly. And you might be able to see that I'm putting in that little bit of an overhang that I was talking about earlier. I do have to be careful here though, because if it hangs over too much, then of course our clearances start to change and it could affect our locos and rolling stock. Generally though, I'm only making the edge hang over by a millimetre or two. It's just a really subtle effect that adds an extra bit of realism. Now, I thought I might have a bit of trouble doing the ramps, but the great thing about using the Slater's plastic art is that it's so thin. Because of this, it couldn't have been easier to bend the strips to follow the ramp downwards. It just needed holding in position while it dried. So as you can see, I now have all the paving slabs stuck down and it's starting to look really good. I was just a bit concerned though that because the plasticard material is slightly raised, if you're looking closely, the paving slabs look a bit like they've just been stuck on the surface. So to make it look more like they've been embedded into the surface, I just used a bit of leftover filler along the back edge of the strips to blend it in. I did this just using a finger to move the filler into position and then spread it along. It took a little bit of time, but it was much easier doing it like this. I did also have to clean the filler off the paving slabs every so often, otherwise I would have ended up covering up all that paint work I did earlier. It did have the benefit of giving the slabs an extra bit of texture though, and also highlighted the mortar courses between each slab in a realistic and natural way. I'd love to say that I did this intentionally and that it was all planned, but in reality it was just a happy accident. I think though I might use this technique intentionally in the future. It just shows when it comes to modelling you do need to experiment sometimes, because every so often you'll stumble across something like this that was completely unexpected. Of course, now I do have the issue of needing to repaint that white filler again to make it the same colour as the rest of the platform. Obviously, if I hadn't changed my mind halfway through the process, then I probably would have held off from painting the platforms until now. That said, it wasn't too much trouble to fill in the gaps. There's now just one more step to completing these platforms, and that is to add a black wash over the surface. As great as they look, they are a bit pristine at the moment, so by adding a dirty wash over the whole area, it'll just give that impression of dirt that's built up over the years. So to do this, I'm just mixing a tiny bit of black acrylic with water, and then using a brush to spread this all over the surface of the platforms. This will also highlight some of those natural imperfections and cracks in the filler that I was talking about earlier. After this, I dabbed away any excess using some tissue, and this created a bit of variation in the wash so that you get some areas that are darker and some areas that are lighter. Now, it may not look like it's adding too much, but in this shot here, you can really see the difference between the platform I've already done and the one I haven't. It really breaks it down just that extra bit, and to my eyes, it's much more realistic like this. And so then it's just a case of repeating this over both of the platforms until the entire surface is covered.
So now that that wash of black paint has dried, you can see that the surface of the platform doesn't look anywhere near as pristine as it did before. It looks a lot more sort of dirty and used now, and you can kind of sort of see bits of the texture coming out in the sort of the filler surface. So yeah, I'm really pleased with how this has come out. I'm really pleased with how all of it has come out, really, considering that I didn't really know what was going to happen. So yeah, it's looking great in my opinion. I have put the station building there just sort of temporarily so you can get a bit of an idea of what it might look like when it's all finished. And also, I couldn't resist putting a train in the station because why not? But yeah, the scene is really starting to come together. Yes, I know there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I need to build up the land behind the building here so that lies flat, do a bit of scenery over here and here as well, and a footbridge and fences along the back and all the little details that need to be done. So yeah, there is still a long way to go. But I think getting the platforms in was definitely the kind of the first step in this, and now all the rest of the scenery can kind of expand outwards. And also as well, I have put in on the far module the ramps that sort of join up to this module, so I'll show you a close-up of that now. And so you can see how the platforms meet each other at the end of the baseboards. The joint is a little bit noticeable at the moment, but I might try and do a little bit of work off camera just to make that slightly smoother. And there's a couple of other little bits and pieces that I need to just sort of tidy up as well. Some filler got on the tracks in some places, so I might need to just kind of clean that off and repaint some of the sleepers. But yeah, aside from that, we're pretty much done today, so that's going to be it for this time. Thank you so much for watching, everybody, and if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe and also hit that bell icon to get notifications, especially if you want to see me continue the scenery on this module. So yeah, as I said, that's going to be it for this time, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!